Right now, as you watch this, roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through a single stretch of water no wider than the distance between two major cities. That waterway, the Strait of Hormuz, sits between Iran and Oman, and it is the most strategically important piece of geography on the planet. For decades, Iran has treated this choke point like a strategic weapon, a card it could play whenever tensions with the West escalated. But something has changed quietly without the fanfare that usually accompanies these kinds of shifts. Iran's leverage over Hormuz is not what it used to be, and the implications reach further than most people realize. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what's happening, why it matters, and what to watch for next. Let me make this real for you. When something disrupts that narrow passage, the price of gasoline at your local station can jump within days. Shipping companies adjust routes, which means the products you buy take longer to arrive and cost more. Airlines face higher fuel costs, and that affects ticket prices. For millions of families around the world, stability in Hormuz is not an abstract foreign policy concern. It is something that touches their budget, their travel plans, and their sense of security about what comes next. So when I tell you that the balance of power in this critical waterway has shifted in ways few people are talking about, I want you to understand that this is not a story about generals and politicians. This is a story about all of us and the world we live in. The Strait of Hormuz is roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, which means naval forces on either side can monitor and, in theory, control traffic passing through. For years, Iran's strategy relied on two things: visibility and threat. By making its military presence obvious and repeatedly warning that it could close the strait if necessary, Iran kept global markets nervous, and nervous markets tend to price in risk premiums. That risk premium translated into higher oil prices, which gave Iran economic leverage even under sanctions. The logic was simple. Sanctions can squeeze my economy, but if I control the world's oil transit point, the world will think twice about how hard to squeeze. This was Iran's version of mutually assured destruction, a concept you might remember from Cold War politics between the United States and Soviet Union, where both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other, so neither side dared to strike first. But here is what is quietly reshaping this decades-old dynamic. Several factors have converged to erode Iran's stranglehold on the strait. The first is technological. The United States and its regional partners have significantly expanded their surveillance and rapid response capabilities in the Persian Gulf. Drones that can patrol the waters continuously, satellite systems that can track every vessel moving through the strait, and naval forces positioned to respond within hours rather than days. What this means is that Iran's traditional advantage, the ability to threaten the flow of traffic, has been partially offset by the ability of Western powers to detect, deter, and disrupt any attempt at interdiction. Iran can still make threats, but the credibility of those threats has weakened because the technology to counter them has gotten much better. The second factor is geopolitical. Over the past several years, regional dynamics have shifted in ways that have isolated Iran further. Normalization agreements between certain Gulf states and Israel, though complicated, shifted the strategic calculus. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have invested heavily in their own defensive capabilities. The Abraham Accords created new security partnerships that changed how the region coordinates responses to Iranian provocations. Iran once had a relatively unified bloc of influence across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. That network is still there, but it has faced increasing pressure and fragmentation. When you combine external technological advantage with internal regional isolation, you get an Iran that has more difficulty translating its geographic position into actual leverage. But here is the twist that most news coverage misses. The weakening of Iran's grip on Hormuz does not mean the strait has become safer or more stable. In some ways, it has become more volatile, and that is where the real story lies. When one power loses a monopoly on a threat, the equilibrium that held things in place starts to wobble. Other actors begin to test boundaries. Regional rivals feel emboldened to push harder. And here is what few analysts are talking about. Iran itself may be forced to seek new tools to maintain relevance, which could lead to riskier behavior rather than less. Think of it like this. Imagine you are the biggest kid on a playground because you control the only ball everyone wants to play with. If someone takes away your exclusive control over that ball, you do not simply walk away calmly. You either find a new way to stay relevant or you do something dramatic to remind everyone why you still matter. The economic dimensions of this shift are significant and deserve careful attention. When Iran had stronger leverage over Hormuz, its threat served as a ceiling on how far Western powers would push sanctions and pressure. The calculation was straightforward. Push Iran too hard, and they might retaliate by disrupting oil shipments, causing a global energy crisis. That ceiling constrained Western policy. But as that ceiling weakens, Western governments have felt more freedom to apply additional pressure. The result is a paradox. Iran's reduced ability to threaten Hormuz has paradoxically given Western adversaries more room to act aggressively against Tehran, not less. This might sound counterintuitive, so let me unpack it. A gun is most powerful when it is holstered but clearly visible. The threat of its use creates leverage. Once others believe you cannot actually fire that gun effectively, the threat evaporates, and with it, your leverage to negotiate or deter. Now, what does this mean for global energy markets and the everyday consequences I mentioned earlier? The effects are layered and somewhat paradoxical. On one hand, the immediate risk of a sudden Hormuz closure has arguably decreased. Better monitoring and deterrence make a complete shutdown less likely. On the other hand, the underlying instability that made Hormuz so important has not disappeared. It has simply evolved. Iran still has significant naval capabilities, still controls territory along the Strait's northern shore, and still has motivation to assert influence in any way it can. The game has changed, but the game is far from over. For the average person watching this, the practical takeaway is this. The energy market premiums that used to be priced into shipments through Hormuz are compressing. That might sound like good news, but it also means markets are underestimating the residual risk. When investors and traders assume stability, they adjust their positions accordingly. If something happens that reminds them the strait is still contested, the price reaction can be sharper because expectations had been calibrated to a lower threat level. This is why monitoring these dynamics matters, not just for analysts and policymakers, but for anyone who fills up a gas tank, flies for business or vacation, or buys products shipped from Asia to Europe. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you knew that a key global choke point was undergoing a quiet transformation that most people were not paying attention to, would that change how you think about your own exposure to energy price swings? Would you think differently about planning a road trip, buying a plane ticket, or making decisions about transportation costs? Those might feel like small personal things, but they aggregate into massive economic signals. Understanding the bigger picture helps you make better decisions with your own money and time, and that is what this channel is built to help you do. If you are finding this breakdown useful, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We track these developments in real time, and the next update could change the entire picture. While you are deciding whether to subscribe, let me show you what is really driving this crisis, and why the stakes are higher than most headlines suggest. The historical context here is crucial. Iran's relationship with Hormuz did not start with the Islamic Revolution in 1979. It goes back much further. Before the revolution, Iran under the Shah was actually a key ally of Western powers and had a Sandaihwa military that included significant naval capabilities. The strait was seen as a stabilizing force because a friendly Iran helped keep it open. After the revolution, the calculus reversed. The new Iranian government viewed Western presence in the Gulf as an existential threat and built its military and strategic posture around the ability to challenge that presence. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s cemented this posture because Iraq, backed by Western powers, tried to strangle Iran's economy by attacking its oil infrastructure. Iran learned a brutal lesson during that war. It needed to hold something vital that others could not afford to have disrupted, and the strait was that something. Over the following decades, Iran's strategy evolved from pure military deterrence to a hybrid approach that combined conventional military capability with asymmetric tactics. Think of asymmetric tactics as using smaller, smarter, less expensive tools to counter larger, more expensive ones. Instead of trying to match American naval power ship for ship, Iran developed fast attack boats, naval mines, and precision missiles that could threaten much larger vessels. It developed underground facilities and dispersed command structures that made it harder to eliminate in a single strike. This approach gave Iran a cost-effective way to maintain leverage without needing to win a conventional naval battle. But here is what has changed in recent years. The United States and its partners have invested heavily in counter-asymmetric capabilities, sequestered minesweeping technology, integrated air defense systems that can neutralize missile threats, and network-centric warfare that allows different platforms and units to share information and coordinate responses. The result is that Iran's asymmetric advantage is being progressively eroded. A fast attack boat that might have posed a serious threat a decade ago now faces a much more sophisticated response capability. Missiles that might have penetrated older defense systems now have a much harder time reaching their targets. This does not mean Iran is harmless. It means the cost-benefit calculation of using those tools has shifted. This brings us to the human dimension of this story. For ordinary people in Iran, these strategic shifts have real consequences. Economic pressure from sanctions has devastated living standards. Inflation has eroded savings. The currency has lost massive value against the dollar. Young Iranians face high unemployment and limited opportunities. The people who pay the price for these geopolitical games are not the generals or the politicians. They are teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, and students trying to build something with their lives. When we talk about Iran's grip on Hormuz being weakened, we are also talking about a country that has fewer tools to negotiate better terms for its people. That is a human tragedy embedded in a strategic analysis, and it matters. There is also the dimension of how this affects other countries in the region. Countries like Iraq, which sits at the crossroads of these tensions, faces pressure from multiple directions. Iran exerts significant influence through political networks and armed groups. The United States maintains a military presence partly to check Iranian power. The resulting pressure on Iraqi governance creates instability that affects ordinary Iraqi citizens. Yemen, which sits outside the strait but is connected to these dynamics through the broader proxy conflict, has suffered one of the world's worst humanitarian crises because of this larger struggle. These are not abstract geopolitics. These are millions of lives shaped by decisions made in corridors of power most people will never see. So what does the forward look like? I want to lay out 3 scenarios for you based on current trends. The first is continued erosion. Iran maintains its current posture, but with decreasing effectiveness. Regional partners continue to coordinate more closely, and Western technological advantages continue to compound. In this scenario, the risk of a dramatic Hormuz disruption decreases, but the underlying tensions remain and occasionally flare up in proxy conflicts and diplomatic standoffs. This is the most likely scenario over the next 2 to 3 years, though unlikely to be a smooth path. Think of it as a slow decompression rather than an explosion. The second scenario is reactive escalation. As Iran's traditional leverage diminishes, Iranian decision-makers feel increasingly cornered and resort to more dramatic actions to re-establish credibility. This could include naval exercises that intentionally raise tension, support for proxy attacks on regional partners, or nuclear signaling designed to remind the world that Iran still has capabilities it has not deployed. This scenario is less likely but carries higher risk. The triggers to watch for are unusual military announcements from Iranian state media, unusual quietness followed by sudden aggressive actions, or statements from Iranian leaders referencing extreme measures. If you see any of these signals, that is when the risk premium in energy markets should spike significantly. The third scenario is a quiet accommodation. Internal political dynamics in Iran shift toward pragmatic leadership that seeks to reduce tensions in exchange for economic relief. Western powers, facing their own domestic pressures from energy prices, have incentive to negotiate rather than escalate. Both sides find a way to dial back the confrontation without publicly declaring a dramatic shift. This would be a positive outcome, but is the hardest to achieve because it requires political will on both sides and faces domestic opposition from factions that benefit from continued tension. The triggers here are diplomatic signals, unusual back-channel contacts, or language from both sides that suggests mutual recognition of the costs of continued confrontation. Here is what I want you to monitor in the coming weeks. First, watch for statements from Gulf Cooperation Council countries about Hormuz stability, because they are the closest to this dynamic, and their public statements often signal private calculations. Second, watch for shifts in oil futures pricing, because commodity markets are forward-looking and will price in risk scenarios before they materialize. Third, watch for any announcements of military exercises in the Persian Gulf region, because exercises are sometimes used as signals of readiness or intent. These 3 indicators will give you a window into how the situation is evolving without needing to parse complex diplomatic reporting. The closing thought I want to leave you with is this. The story of Hormuz is not just about military balance or strategic leverage. It is about how invisible forces shape the world you live in. The oil that fuels your car, the products that fill store shelves, the vacations you plan, and the business trips you take, all of it moves through waters that are contested by powers far more complex than most headlines suggest. When one of those powers loses grip, it does not mean calm. It means new dynamics, new risks, and new opportunities for misunderstanding. Staying informed about these shifts is not just an intellectual exercise. It is practical knowledge that helps you navigate a world that is always changing beneath the surface. Subscribe for our next deep dive. We are already tracking the next development, and it could change everything.